In this video, we're going to look at stack panels. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new WPF app with the .NET framework. And the idea behind stack panels is that you can stack elements on top or next to each other. So as you see inside of our window, we still have a grid by default, and let's change that. Let's actually create a stack panel here instead. And what I want to do here is I just want to stack a bunch of buttons. Okay, so I'm going to create a button here, and this one will be my button 1. And then I'll just create a couple of more buttons in here. Okay, so if we look at our UI, this is the UI that we are getting right now. So let's change that up a little bit. Let's make this like 200 pixels wide and something like, I don't know, 200 pixels high as well. Okay, so this is what our UI will look like. So we have a button here at the top. And now what a stack panel allows us to do is to stack elements next or on top of each other. So let me just stack another button in here. So this one will be button 2. Okay, and then another one. This one will be button 3. Okay, so that's what the stack panel does. And it's not limited to buttons. You can use any type of UI element in here. So it will just stack the UI element based on its position inside of the stack panel. So here, if I change button 3 to be at the top, now you will see that it will be also in the UI at the top. So that's how a stack panel treats its children. It takes them, and based on the line of code that they are at, it will position them in order. Okay, now what if you want to stack elements next to each other? Well, there you can also use a stack panel, of course, and you can change the orientation property. This orientation is by default set to vertical. Okay, so that's something that we don't even have to set up. By default, this is what is happening when you create a stack panel, even without this line of code. But once you add it here, you can of course change the property up. So if you don't know what you can enter here, what you can do is you can use Control and space, and Visual Studio will then offer you the different options that you have. In this case, let's use horizontal. And we can see that now the buttons are stacked, but they are stacked next to each other. Okay, so let me use vertical for this main stack panel. And now let's create another stack panel in here, orientated horizontally. So the orientation will be horizontal. And now let me add a button for 1. So here I'm going to call this one button for 1. And then another button, which will be next to it, button for 2 and button for 3, for example. Okay, so this is how I can stack elements next to each other if I want to basically use UI elements that need to be next to each other. That's always a good way to do it. If you want to make sure that the stack panel is displaying its children centered, so in a centered way, you can use a property called horizontal alignment. Okay, so here you can, for example, say that it should be centered. What this will do is it will center your stack panel. It won't center the buttons will still be in the stack panel as they are, but everything that is inside of the stack panel will be centered. Now, the thing about stack panels is that they consider their children, that they will take infinity space. So basically it can overflow here. So if I have a button for 4, you can see that now the buttons will overflow and will get outside of the screen. So they are out of the edge of our screen, which is usually not what you want. So you have to be really careful here. The same goes for a vertical stack panel. Okay, so you can see here now we also have all of these buttons, and they basically push whatever is underneath it just further down. And also what you can see is that the buttons by default only take the height that they need for their children to display. In this case, the children is the text. So for the button to display correctly. As large as the text will be, that's how large the button will be. So if you play around here with the font size of your button, let's say you make it bigger, then you can see that the button will automatically change its size and appear accordingly in your stack panel. So that's something that you need to take into consideration when working with stack panels. The children get all of the space that they need. And then one more thing that I would like to show you. So therefore I'm going to get rid of this inner stack panel and I'm going to add a couple more buttons. And before I do that, I want to add something called horizontal alignment to the buttons themselves. So for example, you can see that I can center a button, I can position it towards the left, the right, and so forth. So if I center it, you can see that now it will be centered inside of the stack panel that is its parent. Okay, so now let me do the same thing with the other buttons. Okay, this one will be button 2, button 3, button 4. And now you can play around with these values here. Okay, so for example, you can change the left value, then it will position itself towards the left on the horizontal axis. The same goes here for the other button. You can play around with it and use, for example, the right statement. So now the button will be swung towards the right because the horizontal alignment is set towards right. And then you can also use stretch here, and this will then stretch the button throughout the whole screen. You saw that before we entered any of these settings, the buttons by default were stretched. So if I add a new button here, and I'm going to call this one button 5, you can see that the button by default will be stretched and will take the whole available width. Okay, so here we didn't even need to add this stretch statement manually. It was just there by default and was considered as a horizontally stretched button. And the same goes, of course, for vertical buttons. So there it's exactly the other way around. Now, if we were to use a horizontal statement here, you can see that they are all stretched by default because center, left, and right doesn't do anything to them because now they're stacked horizontally. So here you can use alignments that will be vertical. So here, vertical alignment. And you can see that now they have an effect, even though left and right don't have an effect really. So what you can do here instead is going to be bottom as well as top. Okay, so these are the options when you have a horizontal stack panel. And of course, stretch will stretch over the whole height that is available inside of an horizontal stack panel. Now that is the stack panel, and it is very useful if you have a scrollable view. So if you can scroll, and therefore you would use something called a scroll view. So here, instead of just using what we have here with a bunch of buttons, let's say we had a bunch more buttons here, then we would need to be able to scroll. And in order to do that, we need to surround it with a scroll viewer. And this will allow us to then, let me put that in here, scroll. You can see there is a scroll bar here at the side. And now let's open this application or run this application. And we will see that we have these buttons and we can actually scroll. Okay, so you see the limitations that such a stack panel has. The problem that you need to actually be able to scroll if you don't know how much space the elements inside of the stack panel will take. But if you want to stretch the elements that are inside of a stack panel towards both directions, not just based on the orientation, then you would need to use something called a dock panel, which we are going to look at later on. So see you in the next one.